This is a real event. What was recovered from the shattered memory card? Salvage from equipment found scattered across a mud-choked ravine in the Gifford Pinchot National Forest was not the triumphant culmination of a scientific quest. It was a digital ghost, a thermal epitaph. For decades, the legend of Bigfoot has been a tapestry woven from blurry photographs, dubious plaster casts, and breathless campfire tales. It was a phantom of the wilderness, a shy, reclusive giant. The recovered data from the Thorn expedition, however, paints a different picture. It presents the final, harrowing hours of a team of researchers who went looking for a myth and found a predator, proving not only that the creature is real, but that we have fundamentally misunderstood its nature. It is not hiding from us, it is hunting. The story does not begin with the high-definition thermal images of Dr. Eris Thorn, but nearly a century earlier, in the same unforgiving landscape. In the summer of 1924, a group of 5 prospectors, Fred Beck, his son Marion, Gabe LeFever, John Peterson, and a man known only as Smith, were working a claim in a steep, remote canyon east of Mount Street, Helens. They had built a small, sturdy log cabin to weather their stay, a tiny bastion of civilization in a vast, primordial wilderness. In July, the strangeness began. They started finding enormous, human-like footprints in the soft earth around their mining operation. Prints far too large and broad for any man. Days later, Fred Beck was gathering water from a spring when he saw it. Standing across a small gorge, a creature he could only describe as a hairy man watched him. It was massive, covered in long, dark hair, and stood on 2 legs like a human. The encounter was brief but deeply unsettling. Beck fled back to the cabin. His report met with a mixture of fear and disbelief by the other miners. The disbelief did not last the night. As dusk settled over the canyon, their small cabin was besieged. The attack began subtly, with a single, heavy thud against the wall. Then another, and another. Soon, a barrage of rocks, some as large as a man's head, rained down upon their shelter, hurled from the darkness by unseen assailants. The men, terrified, grabbed their rifles. Through the gaps in the logs, they could see them, multiple giant, ape-like figures, silhouetted against the moonlit street slopes. They were not merely throwing stones, they were organized. Some provided a covering volley while others charged the cabin, slamming their immense bodies against the door and walls, trying to break their way in. The miners fired into the darkness, the rifle reports swallowed by the vastness of the canyon. Beck claimed to have shot one creature directly in the chest, watching it tumble backward off a ledge, only for it to rise again and retreat into the trees. 4 hours, the siege continued. The creatures wailed and shrieked, a terrifying cacophony that echoed from the canyon walls. They clawed at the roof, tearing at the chinking between the logs. The 5 men inside, convinced they were about to be torn limb from limb, could do nothing but fire blindly and pray for dawn. When the sun finally rose, the forest fell silent, the creatures were gone. The area around the cabin was a scene of chaos, littered with large rocks and debris. Terrified and exhausted, the miners packed only what they could carry and fled the canyon. Leaving most of their equipment and their gold claim behind, they never returned. Their story, when they recounted it in the nearby town of Kelso, was met with public ridicule and disbelief. Yet, their terror was genuine. The local press sensationalized the tale, dubbing the area Ape Canyon and the creatures Ape Men. a name that has stuck ever since. Forest Service rangers who later investigated found the cabin damaged and the area disturbed as the man had described. They also found the strange, oversized footprints. The incident became a cornerstone of Bigfoot lore, a rare account of a prolonged, aggressive, and multi-individual encounter. For decades, it was dismissed by mainstream science as a tall tale, a fabrication born of isolation and fear, perhaps an exaggerated encounter with a bear or a prank by local youth. But the story of Ape Canyon festered in the minds of a dedicated few, a chilling suggestion that the Sasquatch might not be the gentle giant of popular imagination. This historical account was the obsession of Dr. Eris Thorne. Thorne was a brilliant, if disgraced, primatologist. His early career at a prestigious university had been promising. But his fascination with relict hominids, specifically the North American ape, had seen him ostracized from the academic community. He lost his tenure after using university grant money to fund an expedition to investigate turquoise found in the Blue Mountains of Washington. To his colleagues, he was a crank, a promising scientist who had succumbed to the allure of pseudoscience. To himself, he was a pioneer on the verge of the greatest zoological discovery in human history. He believed the Ape Canyon incident was the key. Unlike the fleeting, solitary sightings that characterized most of the lore, the 1924 event was a sustained interaction with a group of creatures exhibiting complex, coordinated behavior. It was, Thorne argued, a report not of a monster, but of a territorial, intelligent, and highly aggressive non-human primate species. In the autumn of 2023, 99 years after the miners fled for their lives, Thorne assembled his team for what he called the Ape Canyon Vindication Project. His funding was private, cobbled together from wealthy cryptozoology enthusiasts. His team was small but dedicated. There was Ben Carter, a young, tech-savvy documentary filmmaker hoping to make his name with groundbreaking footage. There was Dr. Elena Vance, a bioacoustics expert who had developed sophisticated algorithms to parse animal vocalizations from ambient noise. And finally, there was Kalen Keomaka, a local guide of Yakama descent whose family had lived in the shadow of Mount Street, Highlands for generations. Kale was a quiet, stoic man who carried an old lever-action rifle and a deep knowledge of the land. He did not speak of Bigfoot or Sasquatch. He spoke of the Seattle, the stick Indians of his people's legends, dangerous beings of the deep forest that were to be avoided at all costs. He agreed to guide the team, but his presence was heavy with a warning that Thorne, in his scientific zeal, chose to ignore. Their equipment was the best money could buy. Multiple 4K thermal cameras, parabolic microphones capable of picking up a whisper from half a mile away, seismic sensors to detect footfalls, and a drone for aerial surveys. They made base camp a few miles from the canyon proper, in a clearing that afforded them some measure of security. The first few days were uneventful, filled with the laborious process of setting up a perimeter of sensors and cameras around the camp and along the dim trails leading into the canyon. The forest was eerily quiet. Vance's microphones picked up nothing but the wind in the firs and the distant calls of birds. Carter's cameras captured deer and the occasional black bear. Thorne grew impatient, his confident pronouncements to the camera beginning to sound strained. The first anomaly occurred on the fourth night. One of the seismic sensors on the ridge overlooking the canyon registered a series of heavy, rhythmic impacts. It was not the gait of a bear or a deer. The telemetry showed a bipedal footfall pattern. but the weight calculated from the impacts was staggering, estimated at well over 800 pounds. There was no corresponding visual on the camera pointed at the sensor. The trigger logs showed the seismic event happened, but the motion-activated camera recorded nothing. It was as if a ghost weighing half a ton had walked past. Thorne was electrified. "It's a thermal blind spot," he explained excitedly to Carter's camera. "Dense foliage, a cold pocket of air." The sensor picked up the footfalls, but the subject was perfectly obscured from the camera. "This is proof of concept. They're here." Cale, who had been sharpening a knife by the fire, looked up. His face was grim. "They know about the cameras," he said, his voice low. "They know what they are." The next evening, Digger Vance got her first hit. The parabolic microphone aimed at the canyon wall picked up a low-frequency broadcast. A series of whoops and clicks just at the edge of human hearing. When she amplified the recording and ran it through her analysis software, the screen lit up. The vocalizations were complex, structured, and showed patterns inconsistent with any known North American mammal. They were deep, guttural, but possessed a chilling, flute-like quality in the higher registers. There were call and response patterns between at least 3 distinct individuals, separated by hundreds of yards along the canyon rim. They were communicating, coordinating. That was when Carter, manning the main thermal imaging monitor in their equipment tent, saw it. "Aries, you need to see this now." On the screen, a monochrome world of heat pulsed in shades of gray, white, and black. The deer, a bright white shape, grazed peacefully in a small clearing about 200 yards from their camp. Then, from the black cold of the tree line, another shape emerged. It was massive, a solid white silhouette of intense heat. It was bipedal, with long, powerful arms and a distinctly conical head. It moved with a fluid, athletic grace that belied its bulk. The creature stood motionless for a full minute, a pale statue observing the deer. Then, from the opposite side of the clearing, a second, slightly smaller figure detached itself from the trees. They were flanking their prey. "My God," Thorne whispered, his face inches from the screen. "Look at that coordinated hunting behavior. This is unprecedented." The larger creature took a single, deliberate step forward. It didn't rush. The deer's head snapped up, its ears swiveling. It sensed something, but it couldn't see its doom. The creature lowered itself into a crouch, its heat signature flaring as its muscles tensed. The team watched, breathless. This was it, the Patterson-Gimlin film of the 21st century. Clear, undeniable thermal footage of a Sasquatch hunt. But then, something happened that made the blood run cold. The larger creature slowly turned its head, its movements precise and intelligent. It looked directly at the hidden camera. It was impossible. The camera was camouflaged, 50 feet up a fir tree. There was no way it could have seen it. Yet, the white-hot shape on the monitor stared, unblinking, into the lens for a full 10 seconds. Then, it slowly raised one long arm and pointed, not at the deer. It pointed directly at the team's camp. The second, smaller creature also turned, its gaze following the first's. They ignored the deer completely. The hunt was off. They had found new prey. A wave of dread washed over the group. "They're not just smart," Vance murmured, her voice trembling. "They knew they were being watched. They used the deer as bait to find our camera." Cale stood up and walked to the edge of the firelight, peering into the oppressive blackness that surrounded them. "They are not animals," he said softly. "Animals do not set traps for men. That night, the siege began anew. It started just as Fred Beck had described it, a single, heavy impact against the side of their main tent. Carter, filming Thorne's reaction, caught the primatologist's academic excitement instantly evaporate, replaced by the primal fear of a cornered animal. Another rock hit, then a third. Soon, a hailstorm of stones and heavy branches was bombarding their camp. The high-tech nylon tents offered no protection. The men and women of the Thorne expedition huddled in the central equipment tent, the impacts sounding like cannon shots against the thin fabric. Vance's microphones were overwhelmed with a cacophony of sound. The whoops and clicks they had recorded earlier were now interspersed with deep, guttural roars and a terrifying, high-pitched chattering that sounded like a macabre form of laughter. And beneath it all, something else, a low, throbbing hum that seemed to vibrate in their very bones. It was infrasound, a frequency known to induce feelings of panic, paranoia, and dread in humans. These creatures were not just physically attacking them. They were using psychological warfare. Thorne, his face pale and sleek with sweat, directed Carter to turn one of the exterior thermal cameras toward the perimeter. The image that flickered onto the laptop screen was a vision from hell. The camp was surrounded, at least 5 of them. The thermal showed their brilliant white forms moving just beyond the effective range of their floodlights. They were huge, easily 8 to 9 feet tall, and moved with a terrifying combination of speed and stealth. They were hurting them. 2 were throwing rocks from the south, while 2 others crept along the riverbank to the west, cutting off any potential escape routes. A 5th, the largest of all, stood motionless on the ridge above, a silent general directing its troops. "This can't be," Thorne stammered, toggling between camera feeds. The level of strategic thinking is on par with early hominids. Homo heidelbergensis, perhaps pack hunters. "They are not in your boots, Doctor," Cale said, chambering around into his rifle. He stood near the tent flap, his eyes scanning the darkness. "Their stories are written on the rocks and in the trees. They are warnings we forgot how to read." The debate over their origin, relict hominid versus supernatural entity, was now terrifyingly academic. The scientific theory proposed a creature of flesh and blood, a surviving Gigantopithecus or a cousin of humanity, driven by territorial instincts and the intelligence of a pack predator. Thorne clung to this, analyzing their movements on screen, muttering about biomechanics and social structure even as rocks tore through the tent fabric. The intelligence, the tool use, the pack tactics, it all fit a biological model, albeit a terrifying one. But Cale's perspective, born from generations of oral tradition, felt more true in the face of the encroaching horror. The legends of the Sea Echo didn't just speak of hairy giants. They spoke of beings that could vanish into thin air, that could mimic voices to lure people into the woods, that could induce a madness of fear in their victims. Beings that were not just another animal in the ecosystem, but a malevolent force of nature itself. How else could they have known the location of the cameras? How could they move with such impossible silence? The infrasound they generated was not a biological accident, it was a weapon. The feeling of being watched, the objects moving at the periphery of vision, the sudden, trackless disappearances of people in national parks. The supernatural hypothesis explained the inexplicable. The high strangeness that always clung to the Bigfoot phenomenon like a shroud. As the hours dragged on, the assault intensified. One of the creatures made a direct charge. its massive form a blur of motion before it slammed into one of the empty sleeping tents, shredding it to ribbons with a single swipe of its arm. The team screamed they were trapped, their $500,000 of equipment providing no defense. They were just as helpless as the 5 miners in their log cabin a century ago. Thorne, in a desperate act, grabbed one of the powerful strobe flash units, hoping to disorient the attackers. He crawled to the torn tent flap and triggered it. The world outside was illuminated in a series of blinding, epileptic flashes. Carter's main camera, still recording, captured what the strobe revealed. It was not a simple ape. For a split second, the light illuminated a face. The features were a grotesque hybrid of simian and human. The brow was low and heavy, the jaw massive and prognathous. But the eyes were not those of an animal. They were wide, intelligent, and burning with a cold, calculating malice. The hair covering its body was long and matted, but the skin of the face was leathery and dark, creased with what looked like an expression of pure hatred. Then the darkness slammed back in, and the guttural roar shook the very ground. The last piece of recovered data comes from a small, ruggedized thermal camera that Carter had set up inside the main tent, pointed at the entrance. It was meant to be a reaction camera, capturing the expressions of the team. Instead, it recorded their final moments. The file is labeled CM04 Final. The timestamp shows 3:47 a.m. The thermal image is chaotic. It shows the pale gray heat signatures of Thorne, Vance, and Carter huddled together behind a pile of equipment cases. Cale is a brighter shape near the tent flap, holding his rifle. The air in the tent is cold, but their bodies glow with the heat of terror. On the audio track, beyond their panic breathing, the infrasound hum is a constant, oppressive weight. Then, a new sound emerges from the chattering chaos outside. It's a low, gravelly mimicry. It sounds like a distorted recording of a human voice, playing back phrases it has heard. Need to see this, the voice rasps, a grotesque imitation of Carter. My God, it mimics Thorne's earlier whisper. The team freezes, their thermal silhouettes rigid with a new kind of fear. The creatures had been listening, learning. Then, the tent flap is not opened, but torn from its moorings. A blast of cold night air floods the space, showing up as a black cloud on the thermal feed. Filling the entrance is a solid wall of white heat. It's the Alpha, the massive creature from the ridge. It has to stoop to fit through the opening. Its head and shoulders a colossal, glowing mass. It takes a step inside, and the camera's perspective is dwarfed by its sheer scale. Cale raises his rifle, a tiny stick against the giant. The audio picks up the sharp crack of a gunshot, impossibly loud in the enclosed space. The creature's heat signature barely flickers, it doesn't even flinch. It simply reaches out with an arm that seems impossibly long. The final 10 seconds of the recording are a blur of motion. Cale's heat signature is abruptly swatted aside, vanishing from the frame. The camera is knocked from its position, tumbling to the ground. For a moment, it stares up at the roof of the tent, where the panicked, bright white shapes of Thorne and the others are scrambling backward. Then, the camera's view is completely blocked. A colossal, hand-like shape descends upon it. It is 5-fingered, the palm wide and thick, the fingers like stout branches. Its heat signature is brilliant, almost blinding, a flare of white-hot rage or life force. The audio records one last sound before it cuts to eternal static, the crunch of plastic and glass. And a soft, guttural click that sounded, impossibly, like a sigh of satisfaction. The equipment was found weeks later by park rangers after the team was reported missing. There were no bodies, there were no tracks to follow. There was only the wrecked campsite, the strange, deep indentations in the earth, and a single, shattered memory card. The authorities ruled the team's disappearance as a probable bear attack, followed by scavenging. But those who have seen the final, terrifying footage know the truth. The question is no longer does Bigfoot exist? The footage answers that. The question now is, what is it? And how many others have vanished into the deep wilderness? Their last sight on this earth not the benign, shy creature of folklore, but the intelligent, malevolent eyes of the thing that has been hunting in the dark all along. A thing we have only just proven is real.